In the spring of 1912, the world was filled with excitement over a magnificent new ship called the RMS Titanic. Built with the latest technology of its time, it was considered the largest and most luxurious passenger ship ever created. Newspapers praised its size, elegance, and engineering. Many people believed it was one of the safest ships ever built. Wealthy businessmen, immigrants seeking a better future, families on vacation, and crew members all prepared to board the vessel for its maiden voyage from Southampton, England, to New York City. On the morning of April 10th, passengers arrived at the docks with excitement and hope. The enormous ship stood proudly above the harbor, its 4 giant funnels towering into the sky. Crowds gathered to watch the historic departure. Some passengers carried expensive luggage filled with elegant clothing and jewelry, while others brought only a few belongings, hoping to start a new life in America. Among the first-class passengers were some of the wealthiest individuals in the world. They enjoyed luxurious cabins, grand dining rooms, and beautiful lounges decorated with fine woodwork and crystal chandeliers. Every detail of the ship was designed to impress. The first-class staircase became one of the most admired features, with its magnificent design reflecting the luxury of the era. Meanwhile, second-class passengers enjoyed comfortable accommodations that were often better than first-class facilities on many other ships. Third-class passengers, many of whom were immigrants, traveled in simpler quarters but still found the accommodations surprisingly clean and comfortable compared to other vessels of the time. As the ship slowly pulled away from the dock, cheers erupted from the crowd. Families waved handkerchiefs and hats as loved ones disappeared into the distance. Few could have imagined that this journey would become one of the most famous tragedies in history. Life aboard the Titanic quickly settled into a routine. Passengers explored the ship's many features, including libraries, cafes, smoking rooms, and promenades. Wealthy travelers attended elegant dinners where multiple courses were served by attentive staff. Musicians played beautiful melodies while guests discussed business, politics, and travel adventures. For third-class passengers, the atmosphere was different but equally lively. Families gathered together, shared meals, sang songs, and dreamed about their future in America. Many had left difficult circumstances behind and viewed this voyage as the first step toward a better life. The crew worked tirelessly to ensure everything operated smoothly. Engineers maintained the massive engines deep below deck, while stewards attended to passengers' needs. Officers monitored navigation and weather conditions as the ship crossed the Atlantic Ocean. Each day brought calm seas and favorable weather. Passengers admired breathtaking sunsets over the ocean. Children played games on deck while adults enjoyed fresh sea air. The journey seemed perfect. At the center of the ship's operation was Captain Edward Smith, a highly respected and experienced sailor. Many believed he was the ideal person to command such an important vessel. This voyage was expected to be one of the final journeys of his distinguished career. As Titanic continued westward, wireless operators received messages from other ships reporting icebergs and sea ice farther ahead. Such warnings were not unusual in the North Atlantic during April, and the information was passed along to the bridge. The ship maintained its course while officers remained alert. Passengers remained unaware of any potential danger. They continued enjoying concerts, conversations, and fine dining. The atmosphere aboard the ship was filled with confidence and optimism. Many people believed they were traveling on the greatest ship ever built. On the evening of April 14th, the sea became unusually calm. The sky was clear, and countless stars shone brightly above the Atlantic. The air grew colder as the ship moved into an area where ice had been reported. Lookouts stationed high in the crow's nest carefully scanned the dark horizon ahead. Below deck, passengers prepared for bed after another pleasant day at sea. Some lingered in lounges and smoking rooms, enjoying conversations late into the night. Others retired to their cabins, expecting another peaceful day of travel when they awoke. No one knew that within a few hours, everything would change forever. End of Part 1. The night air grew colder as the ship continued its journey across the North Atlantic. Most passengers had already gone to bed, while a few remained in lounges and common areas enjoying the final hours of the evening. The sea was unusually calm, almost like a sheet of dark glass stretching endlessly beneath the stars. Without waves breaking against icebergs, spotting danger became more difficult for the lookouts watching from high above. At approximately 11:40 p.m. on April 14, 1912, the lookouts suddenly noticed a dark shape directly ahead. An enormous iceberg had appeared in the ship's path. One of the lookouts immediately rang the warning bell 3 times and telephoned the bridge. Iceberg right ahead. The officers reacted quickly. Orders were given to turn the ship and reverse the engines. The massive vessel began responding, but the iceberg was too close. Seconds later, Titanic brushed against the giant wall of ice. Many passengers barely felt anything. Some noticed a slight vibration beneath their feet, while others heard a strange scraping sound along the side of the ship. Inside several cabins, people looked up from books or conversations, wondering what had happened. A few curious passengers stepped into hallways to ask questions. Most assumed it was a minor incident and returned to what they had been doing. Below the waterline, however, the situation was far more serious. The iceberg had torn open several sections of the ship's hull. Seawater immediately began rushing into multiple compartments. Crew members inspecting the damage quickly realized that the flooding was spreading faster than anyone had hoped. Deep inside the ship, engineers worked frantically as icy water poured through damaged areas. They attempted to assess the situation and slow the flooding, but the damage was extensive. Messages were sent to senior officers informing them of the emergency. Soon Captain Edward Smith arrived to inspect the reports. The ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, carefully studied the damage. After examining the flooding, Andrews reached a devastating conclusion. The ship was going to sink. The realization shocked everyone involved. Titanic had been considered one of the safest ships ever built. Many people believed it was nearly unsinkable. Yet the damage extended across too many compartments. Water would continue spilling from one section into another until the vessel could no longer stay afloat. Captain Smith understood the seriousness of the situation. Orders were immediately issued to prepare the lifeboats and wake the passengers. Meanwhile, most people aboard remained unaware of the danger. Some passengers had returned to sleep after feeling the collision. Others gathered in hallways asking questions. Crew members calmly instructed everyone to put on life jackets and move toward the boat deck. At first, many passengers were reluctant. The ship still appeared stable. The lights remained on. Music could still be heard in certain areas. To many people, there seemed to be no reason for alarm. Some passengers laughed and joked about the situation. Others were annoyed at being awakened in the middle of the night and asked whether the inconvenience was really necessary. As crew members uncovered lifeboats and prepared them for launching, confusion spread across the decks. The ship carried lifeboats, but not enough for everyone on board. At the time, maritime regulations were based on a ship's tonnage rather than the total number of passengers and crew. Although Titanic technically met legal requirements, there were far fewer lifeboat seats than people. The reality of the situation gradually became clear. Women and children were instructed to board first. Officers moved from boat to boat attempting to maintain order. However, many lifeboats initially left only partially filled because passengers still believed the ship itself was safer than a small boat floating alone in the freezing ocean. Some husbands kissed their wives goodbye, expecting they would reunite later. Mothers wrapped blankets around frightened children. Friends embraced each other in uncertainty. As the minutes passed, the angle of the ship slowly began to change. Passengers could now feel a noticeable tilt beneath their feet. Water continued flooding lower decks. Crew members struggled to guide people through corridors and stairways. In some areas, icy seawater had already reached cabins and passageways. People who had been sleeping suddenly found themselves standing in freezing water. Third-class passengers faced particular difficulties. Many were unfamiliar with the ship's layout and had trouble finding routes to the upper decks. Some encountered language barriers that made communication more difficult during the emergency. Despite these challenges, numerous crew members worked courageously to direct passengers toward safety. On deck, lifeboats continued lowering into the dark ocean one by one. The freezing air became increasingly harsh. The temperature hovered near freezing, and the Atlantic waters were even colder. Wireless operators remained at their stations sending distress calls to nearby ships. They transmitted urgent messages requesting immediate assistance. The signals traveled across the ocean, reaching vessels many miles away. One of the ships that received the distress calls was the RMS Carpathia. Its captain immediately ordered the vessel to race toward Titanic's location at maximum speed. However, Carpathia was still hours away. Back aboard Titanic, time was running out. The ship's bow continued sinking deeper into the ocean. Water now covered areas that had been dry only minutes earlier. The once grand vessel was steadily losing its battle against the sea. Passengers began realizing the true danger. Panic started appearing in some areas. Families desperately searched for one another. Some people pleaded for seats in lifeboats. Others refused to leave loved ones behind. Acts of courage emerged alongside fear. Several crew members remained at their posts knowing they might never escape. Engineers continued working below deck to keep electricity functioning for as long as possible. Their efforts helped maintain lighting and communication systems, allowing more passengers to reach safety. The ship's musicians gathered together and continued playing music. Their performances helped calm frightened passengers during the crisis. Instead of abandoning their duties, they chose to remain and provide comfort through music. As the hours passed, lifeboats moved farther away from the ship. Survivors sitting inside them watched Titanic from a distance. Many still struggled to believe the enormous vessel could actually disappear beneath the ocean. Around them stretched endless darkness. The stars reflected off the calm sea while the great ship continued sinking lower. On board, conditions became increasingly desperate. The tilt grew steeper. Walking across decks became difficult. Loose objects slid across floors. People clung to railings to keep their balance. More lifeboats departed into the night. The remaining passengers crowded the decks, hoping for another chance to escape. Some prayed quietly, others stood silently beside family members. Captain Smith continued overseeing evacuation efforts. Crew members worked tirelessly despite the overwhelming circumstances. By approximately 2 a.m., only a handful of lifeboats remained. Most had already disappeared into the darkness carrying hundreds of survivors. The bow was now deeply submerged. Water steadily advanced through the ship. Many passengers recognized that there would not be enough room for everyone. Some accepted their fate with remarkable calmness. Thomas Andrews moved throughout the ship encouraging people to wear life jackets and seek safety. Witnesses later recalled seeing him helping passengers until the very end. As the final moments approached, the ship's angle became dramatically steeper. People struggled to remain standing. Those still aboard gathered wherever they could. Some climbed toward the stern as the front of the ship sank deeper beneath the surface. The lights continued glowing against the darkness, creating a haunting image visible for miles. Then, shortly after 2 a.m., the situation deteriorated rapidly. Passengers and crew could hear strange sounds coming from deep within the ship. Massive internal stresses were affecting the vessel's structure. The stern rose higher into the air. From the lifeboats, survivors watched in horror as the enormous ship tilted upward against the night sky. For a brief moment, Titanic seemed suspended between sea and stars. Then the lights suddenly went out. Darkness engulfed the ship, only the moonlight and stars remained. Moments later, the great liner began its final descent into the Atlantic Ocean. The unsinkable dream that had inspired so much confidence was disappearing beneath the freezing water. Within minutes, Titanic was gone. Where the magnificent ship had once floated, there was now only darkness, scattered debris, and hundreds of people struggling in the icy sea. The tragedy had reached its most devastating stage. Yet for those crowded into lifeboats, another ordeal was only beginning. They were alone in the middle of the Atlantic, surrounded by freezing temperatures, uncertain whether rescue would arrive before sunrise. And in the darkness around them echoed cries for help from the water, sounds that survivors would remember for the rest of their lives. When Titanic disappeared beneath the surface of the Atlantic Ocean, a terrible silence briefly settled over the sea. The massive vessel that had carried more than 2,000 people was gone. Only scattered debris remained floating on the dark water. For the survivors sitting in lifeboats, the reality was difficult to comprehend. Just hours earlier they had been enjoying a peaceful voyage aboard the most famous ship in the world. Now they were stranded in the middle of an icy ocean under a sky full of stars. The freezing night air cut through their clothing. Many survivors wore only the garments they had rushed to put on before leaving their cabins. Some women were wrapped in blankets. Children shivered in their mothers' arms. Others sat quietly, staring into the darkness where Titanic had vanished. Then came the cries. Hundreds of people had entered the freezing water when the ship sank. Their desperate calls for help echoed across the ocean. Survivors in the lifeboats could hear voices pleading for rescue. The sounds were heartbreaking. Many passengers in the boats wanted to return and help those struggling in the water. However, some feared that if they approached, desperate swimmers might overwhelm the lifeboats and cause them to capsize. The officers in charge faced an agonizing decision. For a time, most lifeboats remained where they were. The cries continued. Men, women, and crew members fought to stay afloat in water so cold that survival was measured in minutes rather than hours. The temperature of the Atlantic that night was near freezing. Many people quickly lost strength as the cold affected their bodies. Gradually, the voices became fewer. The desperate shouting turned into scattered calls. Eventually, an eerie silence settled over the ocean. Many survivors later said this silence was one of the most haunting moments of their lives. Inside the lifeboats, fear mixed with grief. People realized that countless friends, relatives, and fellow passengers had not escaped. Husbands had been separated from wives. Children had lost parents. Families had been torn apart in a matter of hours. Some survivors prayed quietly, others cried, many simply stared into the darkness, unable to process what had happened. The lifeboats drifted through the night while passengers waited for rescue. No one knew exactly when help would arrive. Hours earlier, Titanic's wireless operators had sent distress signals across the Atlantic. Those messages had reached several ships, but the nearest vessel able to respond effectively was the RMS Carpathia. Aboard Carpathia, Captain Arthur Rostron reacted immediately after receiving the distress call. He ordered his crew to turn toward Titanic's location at full speed. Every possible effort was made to reach the disaster area as quickly as possible. The ship raced through dangerous waters despite the presence of icebergs. Crew members prepared blankets, medical supplies, food, and hot drinks for survivors they hoped to rescue. Meanwhile, the people in the lifeboats endured a long and painful wait. As the night slowly passed, the temperature remained bitterly cold. Some survivors suffered from shock. Others worried about loved ones who had not made it into boats. Children asked questions their parents could not answer. Where is father? Will he come later? Many mothers struggled to respond. In several lifeboats, passengers worked together to stay calm. They shared blankets and comforted frightened children. Some rowed steadily to keep warm and maintain control of their boats. As darkness began giving way to the first signs of dawn, survivors noticed the true extent of their surroundings. Large icebergs rose from the ocean around them. The same icy region that had doomed Titanic now stretched across the horizon. The sight left many passengers stunned. They realized how isolated they truly were. Then, shortly after sunrise on April 15th, a distant shape appeared. At first it seemed like a tiny object on the horizon. Gradually it became larger. Hope spread through the lifeboats. The approaching vessel was Carpathia. Relief swept over the survivors. After hours of uncertainty, rescue had finally arrived. As Carpathia moved carefully through the ice-filled waters, crew members began spotting lifeboats scattered across the ocean. They immediately started bringing survivors aboard. Ladders were lowered, ropes were prepared, blankets and hot beverages waited on deck. The first survivors climbed aboard exhausted and shaken. Some could barely stand, others burst into tears the moment they reached safety. Crew members helped passengers onto the ship and guided them to warm areas where doctors and volunteers provided assistance. One by one, the lifeboats arrived. The rescue operation continued for hours. Each boat carried stories of survival, heartbreak, courage, and loss. Families desperately searched among the rescued passengers hoping to find missing loved ones. Sometimes reunions occurred. A wife would spot her husband. A child would find a parent. Friends would discover each other alive. These moments brought joy amid overwhelming tragedy. But many searches ended differently. Passengers scanned faces and passenger lists only to realize someone important was missing. A husband learned his wife had not survived. A mother discovered her son was gone. Friends waited for people who would never arrive. The emotional weight of these realizations spread throughout Carpathia. As more survivors came aboard, the scale of the disaster became clearer. More than 1,500 people had lost their lives. The numbers were almost impossible to comprehend. Titanic had begun its voyage carrying dreams, ambitions, and hopes from every social class. Now many of those stories had ended in the cold waters of the Atlantic. Once all reachable survivors had been rescued, Carpathia prepared to leave the disaster area. Before departing, passengers looked across the ocean where Titanic had disappeared. There was no sign of the ship. Only icebergs and open water remained. The world's largest luxury liner had vanished. The voyage to New York became a journey of mourning. During the trip, survivors shared their experiences with one another. Stories of heroism emerged. Accounts described crew members who had helped passengers into lifeboats despite knowing their own chances of survival were limited. Witnesses spoke of engineers who remained below deck to keep power functioning. Others remembered the musicians who continued playing music as the ship sank. These stories inspired admiration around the world. At the same time, difficult questions began to arise. Why were there not enough lifeboats? Could more people have been saved? Were warnings about ice taken seriously enough? What changes were needed to prevent future disasters? Newspapers quickly learned about the tragedy. As Carpathia approached New York, journalists rushed to gather information. News of the sinking spread across the globe. People everywhere reacted with shock. Titanic had been celebrated as a triumph of engineering and luxury. Its loss challenged assumptions about technology and human confidence. Crowds gathered outside newspaper offices waiting for updates. Families desperately searched passenger lists hoping to learn the fate of relatives. The names of survivors and victims became front-page news. When Carpathia finally arrived in New York, thousands of people lined the docks. Rain fell as anxious relatives waited. Some families experienced joyful reunions. Others received devastating confirmation that loved ones were gone. The emotional scenes moved people around the world. In the weeks that followed, investigations were launched. Government officials and maritime experts examined every aspect of the disaster. Witnesses testified about what they had seen. Crew members described the collision. Survivors recounted the evacuation. The findings revealed important lessons. One major issue involved lifeboat capacity. Although Titanic complied with existing regulations, the rules were outdated and inadequate for ships of its size. Investigators also emphasized the importance of continuous radio communication and improved emergency procedures. As a result of these inquiries, significant changes were introduced to maritime safety. Future passenger ships would carry enough lifeboats for everyone on board. Wireless operators would maintain better communication standards. Ice patrol systems would monitor dangerous areas of the North Atlantic more carefully. The tragedy led directly to reforms that improved safety for countless future travelers. For the survivors themselves, however, life would never be quite the same. Many carried emotional scars for years. Some struggled with memories of the sinking. Others felt guilt because they had survived while friends and relatives had not. Nightmares and painful recollections remained with them long after the disaster. Yet many survivors also carried memories of courage. They remembered strangers helping one another. They remembered acts of kindness during moments of fear. They remembered ordinary people displaying extraordinary bravery. These stories became an important part of Titanic's legacy. Over time, books, articles, and personal accounts preserved the experiences of those who lived through the tragedy. Historians carefully documented the events. Researchers collected testimony from survivors. Families passed stories from one generation to the next. The sinking became more than a maritime disaster. It became a symbol of human vulnerability, resilience, and sacrifice. Years turned into decades. The world changed dramatically. New technologies emerged. New ships crossed the oceans. Yet people continued discussing Titanic. Its story remained powerful because it combined so many human experiences: hope, ambition, love, fear, courage, and loss. The passengers who boarded believing they were beginning an ordinary voyage could never have imagined how history would remember them. Their journey became one of the most famous stories ever told. But even after investigations ended and safety reforms were implemented, one important mystery remained. Titanic itself still rested somewhere beneath the Atlantic Ocean. No one knew exactly where. The ship had disappeared into darkness in 1912, taking many secrets with it. For decades, explorers searched for answers. And far below the surface, hidden beneath miles of water, the wreck waited silently in the darkness, untouched by sunlight, as the world above continued wondering what had become of the legendary ship. For decades after the sinking, the story of Titanic remained alive in the memories of survivors, the pages of history books, and the hearts of people around the world. Children grew up hearing stories about the magnificent ship that had been called nearly unsinkable. Families passed down personal accounts from relatives who had survived or perished during the disaster. As the years went by, one question continued to fascinate historians, scientists, and ordinary people alike: where exactly was Titanic resting? The Atlantic Ocean is enormous, and the area where the ship had sunk was vast. In 1912, technology simply was not advanced enough to locate a wreck lying thousands of meters beneath the surface. The ocean floor remained one of the least explored places on Earth. While investigators understood roughly where Titanic had gone down, finding the actual wreck proved impossible for many decades. As time passed, numerous expeditions attempted to locate the ship. Researchers studied survivor accounts, navigation records, weather reports, and historical documents. Various theories emerged regarding the exact location of the wreck. Some believed it would eventually be found. Others wondered whether it had been damaged beyond recognition or buried beneath ocean sediment. Meanwhile, the world continued changing. The survivors who had experienced the disaster firsthand grew older. Some shared their memories through interviews and books. Others preferred not to speak about that terrible night. Yet the emotional impact of the tragedy never completely faded. Many survivors remembered specific moments in remarkable detail. They remembered the sound of ice scraping against the hull. They remembered standing on the cold decks beneath the stars. They remembered loved ones they never saw again. These memories remained vivid even after many years. Throughout the 20th century, Titanic became a symbol of both human achievement and human vulnerability. The ship represented the incredible engineering accomplishments of its era, but its loss also served as a reminder that nature could challenge even humanity's greatest creations. Books about Titanic became popular around the world. Historians carefully researched passenger lists, crew records, and personal letters. New generations learned about the people who had traveled aboard the ship. Some stories focused on wealthy passengers who had enjoyed luxurious accommodations. Others highlighted immigrants traveling in search of opportunity and a better future. The disaster affected individuals from every social background. This diversity of experiences made Titanic's story deeply human and relatable. As technology improved during the latter half of the 20th century, hopes of locating the wreck increased. Advanced sonar systems, underwater cameras, and remotely operated equipment made deep-sea exploration more realistic than ever before. Scientists became increasingly interested in exploring the ocean floor. The search for Titanic gained renewed momentum. Finally, in 1985, a team led by oceanographer Robert Ballard achieved what many had thought impossible. After decades of mystery, Titanic was found. The discovery captured worldwide attention. Nearly 73 years after the sinking, the legendary ship had finally been located approximately 12,500 feet below the surface of the North Atlantic Ocean. The images shocked the world. Instead of resting intact on the ocean floor, Titanic had broken into two major sections during its final moments. The bow and stern lay separated by a considerable distance. Around them stretched a vast debris field containing countless objects from the ship. Suitcases, dishes, personal belongings, pieces of furniture. Every item seemed to tell a story. The wreck itself appeared both haunting and fascinating. Large sections remained recognizable despite decades underwater. The famous bow still stood proudly, though covered with rust and marine growth. Scientists and historians carefully studied the wreck. Their findings helped answer many questions about the sinking. The discovery also generated important ethical discussions. Many people viewed Titanic not merely as a shipwreck but as a maritime grave site where more than 1,500 individuals had lost their lives. Questions arose regarding whether artifacts should be recovered. Some argued that objects could help preserve history and educate future generations. Others believed the site should remain undisturbed out of respect for those who had died. These debates continued for many years. Despite differing opinions, interest in Titanic continued growing. Documentaries introduced audiences to the ship's history. Researchers used increasingly sophisticated technology to explore the wreck. Submersibles captured detailed photographs and video footage. Each expedition revealed new information. Scientists learned how bacteria and corrosion were gradually consuming the ship. The wreck was slowly deteriorating. Experts realized that future generations might not see Titanic in the same condition observed during the first explorations. Nature was continuing the process that had begun on the night of the sinking. The realization added urgency to efforts to document and preserve the ship's history. During the 1990s, Titanic experienced another surge in popularity. The story reached millions of people through films, documentaries, books, and educational programs. One of the most influential works was the movie Titanic, directed by James Cameron. The film introduced the tragedy to a new generation. Audiences around the world became fascinated by the ship, its passengers, and the events of April 1912. Although the movie included fictional characters, it also portrayed many real historical events and individuals. Interest in Titanic history expanded dramatically. Museums created exhibitions featuring artifacts recovered from the wreck. Visitors viewed personal belongings that had remained underwater for decades. A pair of eyeglasses, a pocket watch, letters, shoes. Each artifact offered a glimpse into the lives of people aboard the ship. Rather than focusing solely on the disaster itself, many exhibits emphasized the human stories behind the tragedy. Visitors learned about passengers who had boarded with dreams for the future. They learned about crew members who had performed their duties courageously. They learned about families whose lives changed forever during a single night. As the years continued passing, the number of living survivors gradually declined. The youngest survivors became elderly. Their interviews became increasingly valuable to historians. Each testimony preserved unique memories that might otherwise have been lost. Eventually, the last survivors passed away. An era came to an end. No one remained who had personally witnessed the sinking. Yet their recorded stories continued educating future generations. Today, Titanic remains one of the most studied maritime disasters in history. Its legacy extends far beyond the ship itself. The tragedy led directly to major improvements in maritime safety. Modern passenger vessels carry sufficient lifeboats for everyone aboard. Emergency training standards have improved dramatically. International cooperation regarding safety regulations became much stronger after the disaster. The lessons learned from Titanic have helped save countless lives over the past century. Perhaps even more importantly, the story continues reminding people about the value of human compassion during difficult times. When historians examine Titanic, they do not focus only on the iceberg or the sinking. They also remember the acts of courage displayed by ordinary individuals. They remember crew members helping passengers reach lifeboats. They remember engineers remaining at their stations. They remember people comforting strangers despite overwhelming fear. These moments reveal the best aspects of human character. More than 100 years after the disaster, visitors still travel to museums and memorials dedicated to Titanic. Researchers continue studying documents and artifacts. Writers continue publishing books. Teachers continue sharing the story with students. The fascination endures because Titanic represents much more than a lost ship. It represents ambition. It represents hope. It represents tragedy. And it represents resilience. The passengers who boarded Titanic in April 1912 could never have imagined the impact their voyage would have on history. Many believed they were simply crossing the Atlantic Ocean. Instead, they became part of a story remembered around the world. The ship itself now rests silently in the darkness of the deep Atlantic. Far below the waves, where sunlight never reaches, the remains of Titanic continue their slow transformation under the forces of nature. Yet while the ship may gradually fade, its story endures. Every generation discovers it anew. Every generation learns its lessons. And every generation remembers the thousands of people whose lives became forever linked to one of the most famous voyages in human history. The journey that began with excitement and confidence ended in tragedy, but the legacy left behind continues inspiring reflection, remembrance, and respect. More than a century later, Titanic remains not just a shipwreck, but a powerful reminder of the dreams people carry, the challenges they face, and the courage they can show when confronted with the unexpected. Its story lives on, carried across time by history, memory, and the enduring human desire to understand the past.